Khabardar begins a poster issued by the Inqilabi Council on August 28, 1965. The history of the world, it reads, shows that only those who have paid the price of their freedom have attained salvation. If today we allow laziness and lack of courage to come near us, we will never be free. This past week, there have been similar posters stuck up on the streets of Srinagar, commemorating the Defense of Pakistan Day, September 6th. For generations of Pakistanis and their supporters in Kashmir, the day represents the defeat of Indian troops who attacked the country in 1965. As I've discussed in the first of our videos on the 1965 war and Pakistan Defense Day, the story known in Pakistan is 9 parts myth. But in the next 3 videos, I'll be looking more closely at what actually happened. Starting in this video with the story of Operation Gibraltar, which kicked off the war. In the spring of 1965, Pakistani regular forces had initiated a series of limited border incursions in the run of Kutch. India lost the army post of Diyarbakir in those early clashes. Firing and shelling continued along what used to be called the ceasefire line in Jammu and Kashmir. Today we call it the line of control. India responded in mid-May by opening a new front in the Kargil sector in Jammu and Kashmir, occupying some key positions. Although these early skirmishes provoked full-scale troop mobilizations by both India and Pakistan, de-escalation efforts also began behind the scenes. The two countries eventually signed a formal ceasefire agreement on June 30, 1965, mediated by the British High Commissioner in New Delhi in the name of his Prime Minister, Harold Wilson. The agreement resulted in troop withdrawals on both sides, but it wouldn't lead to peace. Pakistan's military ruler, Ayub Khan, thought he had learned a valuable military lesson from the skirmishes in the Kutch. To his thinking, India's armed forces, enfeebled by their humiliating defeat at China's hands in 1962, were now in no position to resist Pakistani aggression. The notion dovetailed neatly with Ayub Khan's very communal worldview, which was that Hindus in general had no stomach or muscle for a fight. The result of his thinking was a plan called Operation Gibraltar. Gibraltar took its name from one of the most valorized battles in the history of Islam. In 1711 CE, the Moorish general Tariq Ibn Ziyad launched his invasion of Spain from the Mediterranean island. What is now called the Rock of Gibraltar on the island was called the Jabal Tariq or the Mount of Tariq in honor of the general and his campaign. Legend holds that Tariq burnt his boats upon arrival, so there could be no retreat. To understand the foundations of Operation Gibraltar, we'll have to go back just a little bit further in history. In 1963, a holy relic purported to be a hair of the Prophet Muhammad disappeared from the famous Hazrat Bal shrine in Srinagar. Faced with massive protests, the apparatus of state pretty much disintegrated. Kashmir came to be run by a parallel administration for weeks before the relic was recovered, thanks to the efforts of the legendary spy Ijwant Singh Hassanwalia. Anyway, that's a story for another time. And the lesson from Pakistan from the Hazrat Bal crisis was that India was sitting on a tinderbox in Kashmir. The fuel was there. All that was needed was a match and bang. From 1964 on, the Pakistani intelligence services began pumping in covert operatives like the colourful Mia Ghulam Sarwar to stoke discontent. Sarwar, who his interrogators later somewhat sourly discovered had 3 girlfriends, a Hindu, a Buddhist and a Muslim, set up a series of secret radical cells inside Kashmir, which was supposed to begin a revolution when Pakistani conventional forces attacked. Inside Pakistan itself, especially formed companies of troops, that's about 120 men, made up of volunteers from Pakistan-occupied Kashmir and Khyber Pakhtunkhwa, as well as personnel from the Azad Kashmir Rifles and Northern Light Infantry, began to be trained at secret camps. Each company had a small component of elite army commandos at its core. 10 Pakistani columns, some 30,000 troops in all by Indian estimates, some 7,000 by Pakistani ones, finally crossed the ceasefire line under the command of the 12 Division's Major General Akhtar Hussain Malik. They struck on August 5, 1965. Each of these columns were named after famous medieval warlords. Khilji for Alauddin Khilji, Babar, Sikandar, Qasim, and so on. For a generation, the legendary scholar Steve Cohen once pointed out, Pakistani officers had been studying counterinsurgency in the United States as the superpower considered how to stamp out people's wars in places like Vietnam. Well, the Pakistani officers were interested in how to start a people's war, and they thought they had it figured out. From the testimony of one of Ghulam Sarwar's agents, Hayat Mir, we have some idea of what the secret forces did. They looted rich Hindus in rural Kashmir, killed pro-India Muslims and National Conference affiliated politicians, and even held courts to enforce Sharia law. There was a grenade explosion in Srinagar's Maisuma and at the Regal Chowk. Posters went up all over the place. Like all perfect plans though, this one had some trouble when it encountered reality. First up, the Jammu and Kashmir police turned out to have a fairly good idea of what had been going on, having infiltrated several of the covert cells. The head of Kashmir's Criminal Intelligence Department, Pir Ghulam Hasan Shah, had provided multiple warnings already to the State Home Minister D.P. Dhar. The warnings weren't taken very seriously by the army initially, but it had stirred up the system to start paying attention. Then a local shepherd, Ghulam Muhammad, betrayed the first infiltrating columns to the Indian army, allowing for much quicker reaction than might have otherwise occurred. That meant Indian counter-offensive operations in Kashmir were far more successful than Pakistan had anticipated. By August 28, 1965, Indian troops had occupied the critical Haji Pir Pass, plugging the main infiltration route into Kashmir. Finally, the internal revolution the Pakistan army was counting on never occurred. General Malik's first wave of infiltrators was followed up by a second wave in late August and a third in early September. But no revolution. Like bad poker players, the Pakistan army decided to up the stakes. Some in the Pakistan army, we know from memoirs, thought the wiser course was to accept defeat and back away. But the ambitious politician Zulfikar Ali Bhutto, who would go on to be both president and prime minister of his country, thought retreat would, I quote, threaten the existence of Pakistan. Military ruler Ayub Khan seems to have gone along with this assessment, despite the growing risk of an Indian conventional retaliation into the plains of Pakistan. On August 29, 1965, a day after the fall of Haji Pir, Pakistan's army chief, General Muhammad Musa, received orders to initiate the attack. These orders included the observation that, and I quote, "As a general rule, Hindu morale would not stand for more than a couple of hard blows delivered at the right place and at the right time." The result was Operation Grand Slam, which kicked in on September 1. It did take Indian troops by surprise, but Pakistani advances in Cham and Jaudiyan were successfully checked. By September 5, Indian troops were able to launch a retaliatory offensive to the south in Punjab, attacking along the Ichogil Canal, the bridge across the Ravi River at Dera Baba Nanak, and the Khemkaran Kasur sector. Strategists in Pakistan evidently had convinced themselves that the fighting would remain confined to Jammu and Kashmir, and thus failed to anticipate this assault. In the next two parts of this series, I look more closely at what happened in Operation Grand Slam and why India's own counter-offensive in Punjab ended in stalemate. There's an important footnote to the story of Operation Gibraltar though. You see, the war didn't end when the war ended. From 1967 Pakistan began pumping in terrorists again. Late on the night of 3 February 1967, one of its covert groups killed a BSF constable in Srinagar, one of the first documented terrorist attacks in Kashmir that directly targeted Indian military or paramilitary personnel. These secret operations would continue all the way to the War of 1971 and afterwards. Indian counterintelligence clocked up many successes against these groups but could never quite stamp them out. The underground cells had succeeded in creating a fairly strange situation in the valley by their acts of terrorism, wrote the legendary police officer Surendra Nath in a classified dossier. In 1975, India finally succeeded in winning its counterintelligence battle because of an operation masterminded by Surendra Nath. It turned the bulk of the radical cadre of these covert groups to the mainstream, persuading them to abandon Pakistan. Yesterday's radicals became today's establishmentarians. Establishmentarians like the senior politician and top lawyer Muzaffar Beg or the storied and highly regarded police officer Javed Makhdoumi. They had all set out to free Kashmir from India. They all ended up helping to protect and build India against Pakistan. I'm Praveen Swami and I'm National Security Editor of ThePrint.